Okay, welcome back. Here we are in part B of the Cold War. In part A, we really talked a little bit about what happened right at the end of World War II and how the world was divided up into these two camps. The West focused on the United States as its major superpower, and the East focused with the Soviet Union or Russia with its major superpower, and how these two areas or these two different philosophies are now starting to butt heads. They haven't done it in terms of military interaction yet, but certainly the potential is there. So let's talk a little bit about how that escalated and what it looks like as we move into the 1950s. Really, the first thing that happens related to who's going to blink first, the West or the East, is related to Berlin. I told you that Germany is divided up into the superpowers after World War II, and so is its capital, Berlin. So the city itself is actually broken up into sectors within Berlin, and the Berlin Wall, which came down in 1990, is what divides the West Berlin from East Berlin. So in 1948, the Soviets decide to blockade West Berlin and not let stuff come in across its territory in eastern Germany to refuel and resupply the people in West Berlin. So we have 2 million people in West Berlin that are cut off with no supplies. The Soviets are hoping that the U.S. and its powers will give up and give over the control of West Berlin to the Soviets. But the British and Americans decide, nope, that's not going to happen, and send planes in to resupply the people of West Berlin. And to do that, to get all the stuff that one needs to run a city of 2 million people, it requires planes landing in West Berlin for every 3 minutes for 11 months. So think about that. 24 hours a day, every 3 minutes a plane lands filled with stuff, ultimately that's going to help supply a city. They were able to do that successfully, and the Soviets released the blockade. Now, we've been talking a lot about Europe and what happened in the Cold War in Europe, but also we have, of course, Asia that is left in a little bit of a new situation after the fall of Japan. Japan had been kind of the biggest bully on the block, and as soon as they were defeated in World War II, China starts to exert its power. But before it can do that, it has to resolve kind of a leadership issue. And there's a civil war going on between Chiang Kai-shek, who is a nationalist, and Mao Zedong, who is a communist. And the U.S. is siding with Chiang Kai-shek because we don't like communism. We don't want the Soviet Union and the Chinese to form an alliance. But ultimately, Mao and his communist forces win, drive the nationalists off of the Chinese mainland and onto the island of Taiwan in 1949. And this is really an international victory for communism. So it concerns the U.S. in its idea of containment, not allowing anybody else to become communist, and that's going to lead into the first hot war, the first actual military action related to the Cold War. That actually happens in the Korean Peninsula. It's called the Korean War, and really after World War II, when Japan leaves and is no longer controlling the Korean Peninsula, Korea is divided into two pieces: North Korea, which is a communist nation, and South Korea, which is a democratic nation. The South is kind of supported by the United States, and the North is supported by China. In June of 1950, the North Korean troops go into South Korea, invade, to try to take over the entire peninsula and unite it as one Korea in a communist fashion. Truman, because he doesn't want to have any more communist nations and certainly doesn't want to lose a democratic nation, sends U.S. forces under General Douglas MacArthur, a hero from World War II, into Korea to try to stop the invasion. And the UN also supports this by sending economic and military aid to South Korea. What happens during the war really is at the first, North Korea is very, very successful. They're pushing the South Koreans back, they're pushing the Americans back into this little tiny pocket at the very southern part of the peninsula. But MacArthur, an incredibly brilliant general, lands troops behind enemy lines and begins to push the North Koreans back. He makes this brilliant military move that allows the Americans to start to win the war. However, very quickly the Chinese troops come in to help North Korea and face off with the UN forces. And we really have a stalemate where there's not a lot of movement by one side or the other, but there's bodies. We're having battles, just not having a lot of movement. So how does the Korean War end? Well, ultimately, Truman says to MacArthur, you do not have permission to attack China. There was even thought at some point that there might be nuclear weapons given to, dropped on China. That is nixed by the Truman administration. And MacArthur criticizes that policy publicly. So you don't criticize your president without some repercussions. So Truman ultimately fires MacArthur for insubordination. Soon after that, peace talks begin between the two Koreas, and the war officially ends in 1953. But 54,000 Americans are killed during this war. Obviously lots of Chinese, lots of Korean people, both on the north and the south side, and civilians die. And this is, as I said, really the first hot war, first open battles that are part of this larger Cold War struggle between the West and the East. Very soon after the Korean War ends, we have an opportunity potentially for peace, because the Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, who's really been the architect of the desire for the Soviets to move out and become more aggressive, dies. And at the same time, the new president, President Eisenhower, proposes to limit nuclear power just to peaceful purposes. And he delivers a very important speech to the UN called Atoms for Peace, where let's use nuclear technology only for peaceful purposes. And this is huge because it's a connection with us in terms of Nevada, where a lot of the testing is done. Up in Mercury, just a few miles north of Las Vegas, is where a lot of this science is happening. There's certainly some concerns that are talking about fallout from the nuclear testing. We're testing things above ground at this point, and there's radiation going everywhere, and people are worried about that. And we start to do some talks with the new Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev. But those don't go very successfully, because in 1956 the Soviets move into to Hungary to stop a uprising in Hungary in 1956. And they also then launch the first successful man-made satellite called Sputnik in 1957. So these elements come together, scare the heck out of the Americans, and we're very concerned that not only are we falling behind in terms of technology, but now the Soviets have something that potentially they could launch a nuclear weapon from space, and how on earth do we defend against that? So the U.S. increases funding for space and weapons research. The Soviets do as well, and now we're back onto that big train of who can be the bigger kid on the block, and we lose that opportunity for peace. Citizens, though, start to think about what are the ramifications for having all these nuclear weapons. What is this going to look like? And are we really, comfortable with our leaders having access to this kind of doomsday technology? A lot of this is started by a very, very important book that is published called On the Beach, where the author really outlines what it would look like to have a nuclear war and what would be the fallout of that. Americans start to protest nuclear testing. That happens right here in Nevada. And the Soviets and Americans come together and ban atmospheric tests. They say, all right, we're going to test nuclear weapons, but we're no longer going to do it above the surface. We're going to do it underground. And at the same time, Eisenhower, as he's kind of heading out of power in 1960 to make way for a new president, FDR, who we'll talk about next time, really warns of something called the military-industrial complex. And he says it's not a good idea to have the military and industry connected together, because war makes a lot of money, and there could be decisions made that aren't good for people, but are good for industries militarily. So we have to be very, very careful of that. And we'll see if that comes into play in our next big battle, which is going to be the Vietnam War.